Hi, Stephen from Owner Disown. So the Dell G series has been hugely popular, and quite rightly so. They offer competitive gaming performance at pocket-friendly prices. But they are not the only game in town. Today I will be doing a smackdown between the HP Omen 15 here and the Dell G3, both with a GTX 1060. The Omen 15 can be had for as low as $1,000, but typically it runs at about $1,250, whilst this model of the G3 can be had for $750, but a comparable one with similar specs, albeit with less RAM and storage, goes for about $1,050 on Dell's website. They are both available in 17-inch models also. Now they both have 1080p 60Hz IPS panels. The biggest difference is the Omen has much slimmer bezels, making the chassis smaller and overall more modern looking. The Dell G7 is much the same as the G3, so if this is important to you, then the HP Omen may be the way for you to go. Viewing angles are very comparable, as is the screen flex and the hinge stiffness. The colour accuracy on both is also pretty poor. The G7 often uses the same LG panel as the G3. The Omen panel shows more backlight bleed than the G3, which may be annoying to some of you. In terms of ghosting, I would say that they are both pretty similar. Outdoors, you can see more details on the Omen, but to be fair, they both get washed out with direct sunlight on them due to a generally low brightness. Using my Spider 5 Pro, the LG panel on the G3 and the G7 was slightly brighter than the Omen on all brightness settings. This doesn't translate to better battery life though, despite the Omen having a 70 watt-hour battery and the G3 a 56 watt-hour battery. The G3 uses Optimus, so uses the Intel GPU for non-intensive tasks, whilst the Omen uses the GTX 1060 all the time. The plastic palm rest on the G3 is much bigger than that on the Omen, but since it is made of aluminium, the Omen feels much more solid. The trackpad on the G3 is also larger, but it has integrated buttons and uses Windows Precision drivers. The Synaptic trackpad on the Omen isn't quite as accurate, but I do prefer the separate mouse buttons. I do prefer the keyboard on the Omen. It has less flex than the G3 and the keys are bigger, which is surprising since the chassis isn't as long. The volume control on the G3 only requires one key to be pressed, whilst on the Omen you've got to do the FN key combo, and I do prefer the way Dell does it. The G3 has blue backlit keys, whilst the Omen can be configured in 4 different zones. For some, this is less tiring on the eyes. I do prefer how the power button on the Omen does light up, whilst on the G3 it doesn't, making it a little bit harder to see in the dark. I believe some configurations of the G3 offer a fingerprint reader. Both back panels are made of plastic. The G series is more subtle with a much more plainer look, whilst the Omen certainly lets you know that it is a gaming laptop. Comparing the ports, on the left hand side the Omen has a USB 3 port, separate headphone and mic jacks, and an SD card reader. The G3 has the power connector, Thunderbolt 3 port, HDMI, Ethernet, 2 USB 3 ports and a combo headphone mic jack. Now around the back the Omen has much bigger heat sinks, whilst the heat exhaust on the G3 is actually under the hinge. There's no ports on the back of the G3, whilst the Omen has the Ethernet port, USB 3 port, HDMI, mini display and Thunderbolt 3 port, and I do like having these ports on the back as it keeps the wires away from you. On the right hand side we have the SD card reader, USB 2 port and Noble lock. Now there's not much going on the Omen. You have the hard drive activity light, the USB 3 port and the power connector. The Omen weighs £5 9 ounces and the G3 slightly less at £5 7 ounces, but to be honest they are both pretty portable. Looking inside, we have the Omen 15, the Acer Predator Helios 300 and the Dell G3. You can clearly see the difference in size of the chassis. On the Omen, you'll have some big fans and some large heat sinks. And for storage, you have one M.2 slot and one 2.5-inch bay. On the Helios 300, you have access to the M.2 slot if you do take the back off, but you do have quick access via 2 removable panels for the RAM and the hard drive. For cooling, it opts to use 2 fans right next to each other, blowing through one large heatsink. On the G3 you also have shared heat pipes, but the fans are slightly smaller than that on the Helios, and like the rest you have access to the RAM, M.2 slots and the hard drive. Now if you do opt for the G3 model with the 5400 RPM hard drive and the 8GB of cache, you will start to miss the speed of an SSD. Even if you use the same application over and over again, you'll find that it does take longer. The keyboard deck on the G3 is slightly warmer than that on the Omen, but not by much, with the hotspot actually being more central on the Omen. Both the AWSD keys and the palm rests are cool on both. The Omen definitely gets warmer underneath though, and it has a much larger air vent, so you got to be careful not to block those. Comparing CPU gaming temperatures, you will see that the Omen in yellow is hotter than both the G3 and the G7. This i5-8300H CPU uses less power than the i7-8750H, so if you go that route on the G3, expect higher temperatures. The G7 does the best job cooling the CPU. Undervolting helps across the board, but the Omen continues to have the high peak temperatures, but on average it runs in the 70s. The GPU temperature on both the G3 and the G7 are great. Of course, both are max Q, but as you'll see shortly, the performance is not that far away from the Omen. The 1060 on the Omen is perfectly fine though, so no complaints here. Alright, on to the benchmarks. Cinebench. Out of the box, the Omen boosts more than the G7 and of course the G3, which has 2 less cores, and that actually comes in last. But it's still faster than the i7-7700HQ. Boosting the CPU power allows us to max out the CPU performance, and the gap is actually closed between the G7 and the Omen. In my Handbrake encode, the Omen and G7 are very similar. The 6-core CPU does a great job here. In Adobe Premiere Pro, the Omen is quite a bit faster at stock than the G7, but again the gap is closed when we push more power to the CPU. The 4-core G3 does quite well here and is more than capable of handling video rendering. In TimeSpy, the Omen shows its muscle with the overclocked G7 matching the stock clocked Omen. You can see the effect of the slower CPU in the G3 though, taking an overclock to match the G7. Far Cry 5 continues the trend, and although there is not that much between the average frame rates, there certainly was a bigger gap in the minimum frame rates, which is more important. The Omen 15 is the better performer. In Rainbow Six Siege max settings, we see the same trend, about a 10% difference between each model. And finally, Rise of the Tomb Raider, we see the same thing with the G7 splitting the pack, but the G3 still gets over 60 FPS and overclocks like a champ. So to conclude, I do prefer the Omen 15 over the G7 and the G3. It has a smaller chassis which makes it more portable, and it feels more solid with the aluminium key deck, and it has nice large keys with better backlighting. Now it does perform faster, and its extra heat can be managed by undervolting. Now between the G7 and the G3, I do prefer the look of the G7. It has a subtle look, yet has nicer styling. The G3 is slimmer and is more portable than the G7, so if you're a business traveler, that may be more suitable for you. Now none are ideal for professional editing requiring good color accuracy, but there is no doubt for the average gamer, all three offer great value, especially as they all have Thunderbolt 3 to provide some measure of future proofing. Now, thank you for watching. Like, subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Bye.